What could drive a queen, crowned with power and bound to the destiny of a kingdom, to cradle the corpse of her husband for months, refusing to part with him while the world whispered she had lost her mind? The story of Joanna of Castile begins not with triumph, but with a coffin. Behind the heavy wood, sealed with iron, lay the body of Philip the Handsome, once the most admired prince in Europe. Death had stolen his beauty, leaving only decay. Yet Joanna, his queen, would not let go. Night after night, she leaned close to the closed coffin, murmuring words of devotion, as if he could still hear her, as if his heart might beat again. Witnesses spoke of the stench of rot drifting through the halls, of courtiers recoiling in horror while the queen bent her head in prayer, her lips moving to a man who was no longer there. Was this undying love, a devotion so fierce it defied death itself, or the unraveling of a mind crushed by grief? The chronicles preserved both images, the widow who could not surrender her husband, and the madwoman who lost her crown to her obsession. Yet behind the label of Juana la Loca lies a deeper question. Was she truly insane, or was her so-called madness the most convenient weapon for those who sought to strip her of power? This is not merely a tale of romance turned grotesque, but of politics, betrayal, and the cruel ease with which a queen can be transformed into a prisoner inside her own palace. As we follow Joanna's journey from youthful bride to tragic captive, you will be forced to decide for yourself, was she a victim of love or of power? Stay with us until the end of this story, and if you wish to uncover more truths buried beneath the throne, make sure to subscribe and join us in unmasking history's darkest secrets. Joanna of Castile entered the world in 1479 as the daughter of two of the most formidable monarchs of late medieval Europe, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. To be born into their union was to be born not as an individual, but as a symbol. Her childhood was not one of gentle games or freedom, but of preparation. Every lesson in languages, music, and theology, every hour spent in prayer and protocol, was designed to shape her into a piece on the chessboard of European politics. For Isabella and Ferdinand, their children were not merely sons and daughters, but ambassadors of their dynasty, destined to be married off to secure alliances that would bind kingdoms together. Joanna, their third child, carried this burden from the very beginning. As a young girl, she was described as intelligent, deeply pious, and striking in her composure. Yet she grew up in the long shadows of her powerful mother, a queen remembered for both iron will and religious zeal. Joanna learned quickly that her worth would never be measured by her own desires, but by the strength of the alliances her hand in marriage could create. In 1496, that destiny arrived in the form of Philip of Habsburg, known across Europe as Philip the Handsome. He was the heir to the Burgundian Netherlands and, through his father, linked to the Habsburg Empire. Their union would stitch Spain and Burgundy together, binding the future of two powerful dynasties. The wedding in Flanders was celebrated with pomp, and for a brief moment, it seemed to be more than a political arrangement. Joanna was swept into Philip's orbit with genuine passion. The chroniclers describe her as completely enthralled by her husband, consumed by desire and affection that seemed to overwhelm her otherwise reserved character. For a young woman raised in strict Castilian discipline, Philip's charm and physical allure must have felt like a fire breaking through stone. She followed him eagerly, devoted to him with a fervor that was both romantic and consuming. At first, their union looked like a storybook match. the beautiful prince and the Spanish princess, walking hand in hand through courts shimmering with candlelight and music, drew the admiration of nobles and courtiers. Their passion was no secret, and Joanna's attachment to Philip was clear to all who observed them. Yet within this golden image, shadows began to form. Philip's epithet, the handsome, spoke not only of his striking appearance, but also of the dangerous ease with which he charmed those around him. Women at court vied for his attention, and Philip rarely resisted their glances. What began as a marriage of passion soon revealed the imbalance between Joanna's devotion and Philip's restlessness. Her love burned steadily, while his wandered. Reports from the Burgundian court painted a picture of a young queen who could not bear to be parted from her husband. While courtiers whispered of Philip's affairs and coldness toward her intensity, Joanna's vulnerability, her deep emotional reliance on him, was set against a man who reveled in admiration and variety. For the princess who had once been trained to be an unfeeling political token, love had become both her liberation and her prison. The court became a stage of contrasts. On one side, the glitter of tournaments, balls, and diplomacy. On the other, the private despair of a wife who longed for fidelity and warmth, yet often found herself abandoned to Philip's ambitions and pleasures. Each absence, each rumor of another woman, deepened her need to hold him tighter. What began as a radiant union slowly turned into a story of imbalance, where love was not equally returned. Here lies the fragile foundation of Joanna's tragedy. She had been raised to understand her life as service to power, but when love entered, it seized her completely. In Philip, she found not only a husband, but the center of her emotional world. To lose even a fragment of his affection felt like losing herself. This vulnerability, once hidden under royal ceremony, would soon become the very weapon used against her. And as her devotion deepened, so too did the forces conspiring to paint her not as a queen in love, but as a woman slipping toward instability. The marriage that had once seemed luminous soon darkened into a battlefield of whispers and suspicions. Joanna, so intensely attached to her husband, began to show signs of emotional turmoil whenever he strayed from her side. In the glittering courts of Burgundy, her devotion became a spectacle, and what had once been admired as passion now began to be described as obsession. When Joanna protested Philip's affairs or expressed her anguish too openly, courtiers took note. To them, her grief was not the mark of a wronged wife, but the proof of a queen losing her reason. It was within this courtly environment that the first rumors of her instability began to take shape. Advisors and nobles who sought favor with Philip understood the usefulness of such stories. By painting Joanna as unbalanced, they elevated his authority and diminished hers. For a husband eager to command without interference, the label of madness was not a tragedy, but a tool. Each time she confronted him in public, each time her emotions overflowed in scenes that scandalized the aristocracy, another stone was laid in the foundation of a reputation that would haunt her for life. The betrayal cut deeper because it was not confined to the court. Across the sea, in Spain, her parents Isabella and Ferdinand observed the reports filtering in from Flanders. Isabella, stern and calculating, was said to be concerned with her daughter's ability to govern. Ferdinand, ever the strategist, recognized the opportunity in these tales. If Joanna could be branded incapable, then their grip on Castile and Aragon could be preserved even after Isabella's eventual death. Thus, the very people who had raised her to be a political token now found reason to question her worth as a sovereign. Within the walls of her marriage, Joanna fought battles that no queen could win. Philip's charm captivated everyone, while her demands for fidelity marked her as unstable. She wept, she raged, she clung, and in every gesture her enemies saw madness instead of humanity. To love too deeply was dangerous, and Joanna's love had become a weapon turned against her. The court that once dazzled her now echoed with whispers. Servants carried gossip through corridors. Nobles exchanged knowing glances, and Philip himself seemed to find satisfaction in the narrative that placed her below him. The isolation was suffocating. Even when surrounded by attendants, Joanna stood alone. Her mother's expectations pressed down on her from afar. Her father calculated how best to use her plight, and her husband dismissed her cries as folly. Every expression of grief or anger confirmed the story others told of her. She became trapped in a cycle where resistance only fueled the accusations. The more she demanded love, the more she was mocked. The more she pleaded for loyalty, the more she was portrayed as unhinged. It is in this crucible of betrayal that the fragile line between truth and propaganda blurred. Was Joanna truly unstable, or was her reputation carefully cultivated by those who needed her weakened? The chronicles of the time were written largely by men who served interests of power, not by Joanna herself. Her voice was buried beneath the ink of others, while Philip and his circle thrived on the image of a queen undone by passion. By the time Isabella's health declined in Spain, Joanna's name had already become entwined with rumors of madness. The succession of Castile loomed, and with it, the question of who would truly rule. Would it be Joanna, the rightful heir, or Philip, the ambitious husband who had learned how useful a reputation could be? In this tension between family loyalty and political ambition, between love and betrayal, Joanna found herself caught with no escape. Her loneliness deepened, her despair sharpened, and what had once been a marriage of devotion transformed into chains of humiliation. It was in this atmosphere of doubt and manipulation that the next chapter of her life would unfold, a chapter marked by sudden death and the descent into legend. In September of 1506, the glitter of Burgundy dimmed forever. Philip the Handsome, just 28 years old, collapsed and died in the city of Burgos. The official cause given was fever, perhaps brought on by typhoid or malaria. Yet from the very beginning, there were whispers that his death had been no accident. Some suggested poison, others hinted at political intrigue. For in the struggle over Castile, there were many who stood to gain from Philip's absence. Whatever the truth, his passing was sudden, brutal, and left Joanna not only widowed, but unmoored. The court reeled, but none more than the queen. For Joanna, Philip had been the axis on which her world turned. Their love had been fraught, poisoned by betrayal, yet he remained the center of her being. When his body grew cold, something inside her seemed to fracture. She refused to bury him, refused even to allow the coffin to be set aside. The chronicles describe a shocking sight. A queen, crowned in black, kneeling beside a sealed coffin as if it were still a living presence. She bent close, whispering words of love and prayer, her fingers tracing the wood as though it were flesh. From town to town, the coffin was carried, and Joanna followed. The procession cut across the Spanish landscape, not like a funeral march, but like a pilgrimage of obsession. Villagers who watched from the roadside spoke of a queen who guarded the casket fiercely, forbidding anyone to approach. Nights were spent in chapels or roadside cloisters, with Joanna refusing to leave the coffin's side. In some accounts, she ordered that no woman be allowed near. fearful that even in death her husband might be stolen from her. The image is unforgettable. A royal bier surrounded by flickering torches. Soldiers and courtiers weary from travel, and at the center, a queen leaning into the silence of death. The smell of decay clung to the air, masked poorly by incense. Priests murmured prayers, but Joanna's voice was louder, her whispers insistent, as if she could still bind him to her by the force of her love. It was here that the name took hold. Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. To the court and the clergy, her refusal to release Philip was evidence of insanity. To the people, it became a tale told with both pity and fear. A queen who would not bury her king, who carried his coffin across the land as though she could keep him alive, was not seen as devoted but as deranged. The label spread quickly, woven into proclamations and chronicles, until it clung to her as tightly as the black garments of mourning she wore. Yet beneath this legend lies the ambiguity that defines her story. Was this the unraveling of a fragile mind destroyed by grief, or was it the weaponization of sorrow by those eager to discredit her? The death of Philip created a vacuum of power. Ferdinand, her father, returned to Castile to secure his claim. Advisors who had once served Philip now turned to new patrons. The easiest way to push Joanna aside was to brand her incapable. Her devotion, her refusal to bury him, provided the perfect evidence. As the coffin moved slowly through the night, so too did the story of a queen collapsing under the weight of her own heart. What began as a widow's grief became the foundation of a legend that would imprison her for the rest of her life. And while Spain marched on, while crowns and treaties shifted, Joanna remained fixed beside the corpse of the man who had both enchanted and betrayed her. The death of Philip opened a door that others were eager to walk through. Ferdinand, Joanna's father, wasted no time in stepping into the vacuum left behind. Returning from Aragon, he declared that his daughter, though queen in name, was incapable of ruling, with the weight of experience, reputation, and the machinery of power behind him. He pressed his claim as regent. It was a convenient arrangement. Joanna still lived, still bore the title of queen, but her authority was stripped away in whispers and proclamations that painted her as a woman lost to madness. Thus began her long exile within the walls of Tordesillas. The fortress, set upon the plains of Castile, was to become her prison for nearly half a century. What had once been a palace alive with music and diplomacy transformed into a mausoleum for both a queen and the memory of her dead husband. In those rooms, the remnants of her past clung to her. The coffin that had followed her across Spain was brought within those walls. It no longer carried the beauty of Philip, but the decay of decades. Yet Joanna, bound by devotion or obsession, would not abandon it. She sat near it, whispered to it, guarded it with the same fervor that once shocked the kingdoms of Europe. The image of her decline is haunting. Courtiers who glimpsed her spoke of tangled hair, of clothes that hung in tatters upon a body once adorned with jewels. The proud daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, once groomed to dazzle courts, now walked barefoot across cold stone floors, muttering prayers and fragments of conversations to a coffin long emptied of all but dust and bone. At times she refused food, at other times she raged against her guards, and often she slipped into long silences broken only by the sound of her voice addressing Philip, as if he might still answer. The court of Tordesillas became a theater of neglect. Servants maintained the bare minimum of comfort, but no effort was made to restore her dignity. Her children were kept away for long stretches, allowed only carefully staged visits. Political life carried on in Spain and beyond, with her name used when convenient, but her presence erased. To the people, she was a queen in title alone, locked away in the shadows. To the rulers who replaced her, she was the perfect scapegoat, her alleged madness the justification for their control. The question that lingers through history is whether Joanna truly descended into madness or whether the walls themselves drove her into despair. Modern scholars debate whether she suffered from mental illness, perhaps depression or psychosis, or whether her confinement, the betrayals of her husband and father, and the manipulation of her image destroyed her spirit. What is certain is that her voice was silenced. We do not have her words, only the reports of men who benefited from calling her insane. Over the years, her beauty faded, her youth withered, and her world shrank to a handful of rooms and the decaying coffin she refused to abandon. Tordesillas was not just a prison of stone, but a prison of narrative. The label of Juana la Loca became stronger than any truth, ensuring that she remained powerless, remembered less as a queen than as a cautionary tale. Time passed, decades slipped by, and the world outside her prison changed. Empires expanded, wars raged, new monarchs rose and fell. Yet within the walls of Tordesillas, Joanna remained frozen, caught in an eternal vigil beside the memory of her lost husband. A queen reduced to whispers, her legacy defined not by her own deeds, but by the silence imposed upon her. The final years of Joanna's life unfolded in a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the very stones of Tordesillas. Decades of confinement had stripped her of vitality, leaving her frail and bent, a shadow of the young woman who had once crossed Europe as a radiant bride. Rarely did she see the sun. The shutters of her chamber remained closed, the air thick with damp and the scent of wax. Within those walls, time lost its rhythm, day and night blending into an endless twilight. Her world shrank to a single room. The walls, rough with age and cold to the touch, offered no comfort. The floor bore the marks of long pacing, the endless paths of a prisoner with nowhere to go. In the center stood a wooden chair and a narrow bed, stripped of any royal grandeur. At night, the flicker of a candle became her only companion. Its light trembled across her face, revealing the hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes, the pale skin stretched thin by years of neglect. In those hours she often spoke, not to her attendants, but to the void. And in the silence of the castle, her words always circled back to the same name, Philip. Witnesses said she called to him as if he lingered just beyond sight. Sometimes it was a whisper, a tender plea in the dark. Other times it was a sudden cry, sharp and desperate, that startled the guards stationed outside her door. The coffin that had once traveled across Spain no longer stood beside her, but the memory of it remained, a phantom presence in her mind. For Joanna, Philip had never truly left. Even as his body had long turned to dust, his hold on her heart endured, binding her to a love that had become indistinguishable from torment. Her attendants described her as withdrawn, eating little, often refusing to speak for days. When illness came, she resisted medicine and care. Some said she believed the pain was a form of penance, others that she no longer feared the end. The light that had once burned with fierce passion flickered weakly now, sustained only by habit, by memory, by the strange tether that bound her to a world that had long abandoned her. In April of 1555, after nearly 50 years of imprisonment, Joanna's vigil came to its end. The candle that had once illuminated her gaunt features burned low, casting its last glow over a queen who had outlived both husband and parents, yet never escaped their shadows. Death came quietly, without ceremony, in the same silence that had wrapped her life for so many years. She was 75. No great procession marked her passing. No triumphal orations celebrated her reign. Instead, her body was carried to Granada to rest beside Philip and her mother, Isabella. The irony could not have been sharper. The woman remembered only as Juana la Loca was finally united in death with the very figures who had defined her captivity. The end of her story is not marked by crowns or victories, but by the image of a queen fading into darkness. A woman who once embodied the hopes of a dynasty died as a prisoner of both stone walls and memory, her voice echoing Philip's name until the silence swallowed it. History remembers her with a single name: Juana la Loca. It is a title that reduces a queen, a mother, a daughter, and a woman to little more than a caricature of madness. Yet behind this mask lies a story carved not by her own words, but by the hands of men who gained power through her silence. Was Joanna truly consumed by illness? Or was she a prisoner of a narrative designed to strip her of authority? The chronicles speak of her as unfit to rule, but we must ask whose voices were preserved. Her husband, who benefited from whispers of instability. Her father, who claimed regency by declaring her incapable. Her son, Charles Fouque, who kept her confined while he built an empire. At every turn, her so-called madness served the ambitions of others. What little survives of Joanna herself is filtered through the eyes of those who needed her to be weak. Perhaps she was fragile. Perhaps she suffered deeply from grief and loss. Yet even fragility does not erase the truth that she was also betrayed, isolated, and used. The symbols of her life are unforgettable. A coffin carried across Spain, guarded as if it still breathed. Stone walls that swallowed her voice for nearly 50 years. A name called into the darkness, unanswered but never abandoned. These images endure because they speak to something larger than a queen's tragedy. They speak to the ease with which love can be twisted into accusation, and power can turn devotion into chains. So we must ask, has history been just to Joanna of Castile, or has it buried her beneath the legend of the Mad Queen, leaving her humanity forgotten? Perhaps her true legacy is not in the throne she never ruled, but in the questions her story forces us to confront. How often have women been branded unstable to justify their erasure? How many voices have been silenced behind walls built not of stone, but of rumor and fear? The echoes of Joanna's life linger still. The coffin, the walls, the whispers in the night. They remind us that history is not only about kings and victories, but about the lives broken to secure them. If this story unsettled you, if you believe more truths lie hidden behind crowns and legends, then stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe to join us on this journey as we continue to uncover the darkest secrets buried beneath the throne of history.